Welcome to everyone to HIV Center Grand Rounds. This is Bob Remien, HIV Center Director. Thank you for joining us through this mode of communication. First of all, clearly, as we know, we're going through unprecedented times. This is challenging for many of us. So we want to thank you for taking the time and joining us today. Also, thank you for your dedication to all of your ongoing work and commitment to your work and your families. We wish you the best as you cope with this. We hope for the best outcomes for everyone, for yourselves and everyone you know. And we do hope you're able to take care of yourselves, both physically and mental health-wise. Just always like to reiterate the tremendous importance of staying in touch with each other, checking in, giving ongoing support. I hope you're all doing. I trust you're all staying close with your family and friends, reminding them of how much they're valued and loved. And also, I think all of us, it's an understatement to say, let's give all the love and support we can to all the people working on the front lines of this health crisis, keeping us all healthy. So again, welcome and thank you for being here. Today we have let me first say by reminding you, not already done so, please mute your lines now and keep them during the entire presentation. After the presentations, we will have Q&A. All you need to do is simply put your name in the chat box, and you'll find that with a small air balloon on the bottom of your screen. You don't have to write your question, just put your name in, indicating you'd like to ask a question, and then my colleague Stephen Sukumaran will call on people sequentially when it's time for the Q&A. But again, mute your lines and keep them muted throughout the presentation. Give a quick introduction to our three presenters, and Dr. Victoria Frye will be leading this. Victoria Frye is an associate medical professor in the Department of Community Health and Social Medicine of the CUNY School of Medicine, where she heads the Laboratory of Urban Community Health. Victoria received her BA in History, her MPH in Biology, and her doctorate in Sociomedical Sciences from Columbia University. Her research combines epidemiology and social science theories to identify multi-level determinants of HIV and violence vulnerability, and using both qualitative and quantitative methods. And she applies these results to design multi-component prevention interventions, testing them using experimental and quasi-experimental study designs. Dr. Frye has authored over 85 publications and in prestigious journals such as JAMA, American Journal of Public Health, Social Science and Medicine, AIDS and Behavior. I could go on and on. And she has served as associate editor of the Journal of Urban Health, 2008 to 2019. She is currently the co-chair of the Board of Scientific Counselors for the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, to which she was appointed in 2016 by Secretary of Health and Human Services under President Obama. Quite prestigious. And then joining her will be Mark Paige. Mark has spent the past 10 years as the project director for HIV prevention studies, first at Project CHANGE of the New York Blood Center, which many of us know well, very important study. He's currently at the CUNY School of Medicine. Most recently, he moved to the TRUST study, which is a NIDA-funded R01 to evaluate through a randomized clinical trial design the efficacy of a brief behavioral intervention to increase HIV self-testing among friend pairs of gay Black men who have sex with men. And then we have David Matthews, who has an MBA in Health Services Administration and has spent 20 years as an administrator of the public health and social services organizations and programs. He has worked at New York City-based CBOs delivering service to multiple communities, including the LGBTQ and homeless, active drug using, and youth communities. He was chair of the Testing and Linkage to Care Commitment for the New York City HIV Planning Group and the community member chair for the New York State HIV Prevention Planning Group, two very important groups in New York. He was an invited panel member during the Office of National AIDS Policy and NIMH HIV Stigma Summit which was held at the White House during the Obama administration, where he discussed aspects of the CHANGE study and commented on the impact of simulation models on the well-being of Black gay men. So welcome to all three of you, and I'm going to turn it over to Victoria to begin the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Can we do a virtual applause, Bob? That's what we usually do when we have grand rounds. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to. Let me know if you can see it.
It's working.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for that warm introduction. And I want to really also thank my collaborators for joining us this morning. It's actually a very busy time for everybody. And thank you to everyone who joined us. And I can't see your faces anymore because I'm in full screen. So if I know there's a process for questions, but just to let you know, I'm also just looking at my full screen. And I want to also just take a moment to recognize and acknowledge anyone who has been affected or whose family or friends, loved ones, community has been affected by COVID-19. Just want to take a moment to recognize how traumatizing this has been for so many people and how many really awful memories this is bringing back for many of us. So again, want to thank you for your dedication to disease prevention, to well-being, to health, to social justice, and all of the work that we're doing. And thank you again for joining us. Before we begin, I think the most important thing with these projects is to recognize that this is never the work of any one person. So this CHANGE study, which stands for Challenge HIV, Stigma, and Homophobia and Gain Empowerment, as with all studies, was a cast of thousands, but there were some folks who were key leaders. First of all, I want to recognize the funding agency NIMH for actually funding a study focused primarily on reducing stigma and homophobia, which is unprecedented, basically, or very rare. Also want to recognize the co-PI of the study, Vaughn Taylor Akutagawa, who's the executive director of GMAD, Gay Men of African Descent, which is, I believe, still in the process of reorganizing. Also want to recognize two of my co-presenters are here, and that's Dave Matthews and Mark Paige, and you'll be hearing from them. But also who is missing from, as we call ourselves, the band, is Steve Gordon, who was working at GMAD at the time, but now is heading a unit at ACS focused on the health and well-being of LGBTQAI+ youth. Also have to recognize Geneva Musgrave, formerly of CAMBA, Joe Phelan, who was my dissertation sponsor, was also a consultant, Beryl Koblin, and also there's a whole bunch of other people who were involved, but I need to call out Emily Green, who did the propensity score matching for us on this study, and I've been working with Emily, Dr. Green, who got her doctorate from Columbia, for the last 10 or plus more years. Okay, so just to get us started, as we all know, HIV care and prevention all depends on access. So we have our strategies of treatment as prevention and primary prevention, and all of those depend on HIV testing as a gateway to whether it's ART, and that requires uptake and adherence in order to reduce individual level viral load, reducing community level viral load, which then reduces hopefully base prevalence in areas and populations. And primary prevention, similarly, HIV testing can lead to the uptake of PEP or PrEP, possibly condom use, other sorts of sexual behavior change that are consistent with maybe a way of thinking about it as harm reduction approaches, but also centering pleasure and sex as an enjoyable activity. So all of those depend on access, all of our strategies to address the HIV epidemic in the US. One of the biggest barriers, though, to access to prevention and care is stigma, and HIV stigma began in the US almost immediately with the advent of our epidemic, where we had a key component of the stigma process, scapegoating, on the front page of the New York Post, where this person was identified as the man who gave us AIDS. And so that really colored how we treated the infection from that point forward. It was later in 2016, using sera stored actually at the New York Blood Center, that it was determined using genetic analysis that, in fact, the HIV had been in the US way before so-called patient zero was stereotyped and scapegoated on the front page of a New York daily. So stigma, as we know, and as you know, because you attended Seth Kalichman's recent talk about stigma, probably can be conceptualized in different ways. Originally, we sort of thought of it as like a static marker. Lincoln Phelan have done great theoretical work outlining it as a socially interactive process. Oh, sorry, Parker and Eagleton, not Paker, really emphasized how important it is to conceptualize stigma as actually part of a system of oppression. And all of those ways of looking at it came to bear on the CHANGE project. And we know that Valerie Earnshaw has helped us sort of understand stigma as something that can be both, it can be enacted, experienced, perceived, or felt, but also internalized and anticipated by people who are the targets of stigma. But as well, the enactment of stigma is something that can be done by individuals and can achieve a community level in terms of attitudes or social norms that characterize levels of HIV stigma as well as homophobia. And that's one of the things that's pretty unique about CHANGE, is that we actually took an intersectional approach to trying to reduce community level negative attitudes around HIV and sexual minority individuals. So we focused on prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping if you're approaching it using Earnshaw's model. Empirically, again, this is information that is surely familiar to you. We know that HIV stigma reduces access to testing, ART, PEP, and PrEP. We also have good evidence at the area level or state level, thanks to some of the work done by your colleagues, for example, Mark Hotzenbuehler, of the way homophobia also works to reduce access to prevention in ecological analyses. We know it from looking at some international samples. We know that stigma and homophobia are also associated with other negative health outcomes, not HIV related only, but specifically mental health outcomes, including some mental health disorders, symptomatology, suicide attempts, and alcohol and drug use disorders. And what the CHANGE project did was it specifically took an intersectional approach to HIV stigma and homophobia, with an emphasis on how these are experienced by African American or Black gay men who face racialized discrimination and race-based discrimination daily. So our project really used the Lincoln Phelan approach to understanding what stigma is in terms of it being a socially interactive process. And that was the bedrock for how we designed and implemented key components of the actual intervention itself. So we thought of stigma as a dynamic social process that involves multiple steps: labeling, stereotyping, separation, discrimination, and status loss. And at each of those steps, we conceptualized ways that community members, so these would be individuals who are not necessarily targets, quote unquote, but people who might actually be doing some of this behavior, labeling, stereotyping, separating, discriminating, offering them alternatives to that, but also really starting from a perspective of understanding why people engage in this kind of behavior and how loved ones of individuals who might be stigmatized could actually think that this is a protective mechanism, that this is something that is going to protect their loved ones. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the future, in a minute. Homophobia, we conceptualized as more part of a system in terms of being part of a system of prejudice and discrimination against a class of people. So if you're familiar with the, stigma and prejudice one head or two idea, this idea that there are differences between things that could be conditions that are stigmatizing and being a member of an entire class or group that is systematically oppressed by dominant members of society and by dominant groups in society. We fell into the two approach with this project and really conceptualized homophobia as part of a system based on beliefs about inferiority of the group. So when we started this project, and I'll hopefully move on to the interesting part in a minute where we get to hear a little bit more about the intervention. This was all the way back in 2013, and previously to us proposing this, there were really not a lot of interventions focused at the community level. Most of them were very individual level. They were not intersectional or layered. They focused on attitudes primarily. So some of the ones that were focused on healthcare providers, and they really also often focused on the individuals who might be doing the stigmatizing or internalization. But the methods that we did know at that time that were effective for reducing stigma were contact as well as education and information. But there weren't many interventions that really tried to evaluate access to prevention. So we proposed CHANGE, which stands for Challenge HIV Stigma and Homophobia and Gain Empowerment. And that was a name that was created by Geneva Musgrave. And we thought it really captured what it was that we were trying to do. It is a community level intervention that we were hoping to evaluate through this funding by the NIMH via the R21 mechanism. So the goal was to reduce HIV stigma and homophobia at the community level to increase access to treatment and prevention. It was a feasibility, acceptability, and preliminary efficacy study using a quasi-experimental matched community study design. And as I said before, it was a partnership between the Blood Center, when I was at the Blood Center, GMAD, and also Brooklyn Men Connect, which is a project of bridging access to care, which was formerly the Brooklyn AIDS Task Force. And David Matthews, who is co-presenting with me today, was the director of BMK at the time. And we were really lucky to be able to work with BMK to execute this project, and you'll understand how central they were both as an organization and a site in a minute. So in addition to the stigma theoretical framework, we also integrated aspects of sociological and empowerment theory. Sociological, really, from that, we drew the importance of space and visibility in space. So this idea that being visible physically in a geographic community, a real community, which is, I'm thinking a lot about this now that I feel like I only exist in a virtual sort of work space now, and all of my real contact is with my family. But that is really important. And that's important also to undermining and dismantling systems, stratified systems of oppression. And that's, that's well sort of documented and theorized in lots of other ways of thinking about oppression. And empowerment also was this idea that individuals love the people in their lives, regardless of whether they engage in behaviors that might challenge their belief systems, and that those individuals want tools that will enable them to reduce the dissonance between and the tension that they feel about these conflicts, and that our project was designed to provide some of those tools, and that would be empowering. And be empowering for individuals and communities. Okay, so I'm going to just introduce what the intervention components were, and then hopefully we can hear from Mark and Dave about what really happened during these components, because there is the what you sort of plan, and then there's the what happens. So the intervention was primarily composed of three components. There were workshops and trainings for community businesses, residents, and CBOs. And so those were specifically formal structured workshops with community organizations, but also very brief interventions that were done in barbershops and braiding salons and any place that would have us, basically. We also had what we called space-based pop-up arts-oriented events, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And we ran a bus shelter media campaign. We have some very elaborated explanatory models that posited as the ultimate outcome increase health and well-being, decrease community viral load and HIV prevalence at the community level. And as that sort of worked through life chances, mental health issues, and some behavioral components, as those worked through actual experiences of stigma and discrimination, isolation and rejection, physical and sexual violence, emotional abuse, and institutionalized violence. And then our change model integrated, really focusing on increased contact and empathy, challenging stereotypes and biases, correcting misperceptions, and changing policies. So hopefully as we talk about the events and the components of the intervention, you will be able to see where we try to do that in each type of event. I'm going to skip through these highly elaborated pathways, but this is just sort of to give you a sense of how we use the Lincoln-Phelan heuristic to help people, to help ourselves sort of communicate with people about the impact of certain types of behavior, whether it was in the home or on the street or in community, that could be harmful to people, but also were ways of keeping people away and down and sometimes keeping people in. So this was the homophobia pathway at the community level. So as I said, there were three major components. Oh, this is really important to acknowledge. So it's not like we just got this small, and I say small, it's a lot of money, but it's also not enough to cover what we did. And that should be obvious to anyone who's ever gotten an R21 or knows what the budget is. The reason we were able to do that was because we used material and approaches that had been used by our community-based organizational partners previously as program. So GMAD had already developed a curriculum and bus shelter ads, which we adapted. The curriculum was incredibly detailed. Mark spent, I don't know, a year or 6 months, a long time making it more understandable. And the bus ad had professional level photos that we could use. Canva had a campaign, which they'll describe in a minute, hopefully, that we were able to use. And so that's how we were able to do this. And we also had these 5 pop-up events that were part of the space-based events. So I'm going to be quiet now and ask Mark or Dave to jump in and just begin describing some of the the activities that we did at this slide is the activities that we did at BMK in the neighborhood. So just take it away. And I can't see anybody, so I have no idea if you're like, no, 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 or yes.
So, hi, good morning. It's David Matthews here. I always go by Dave. And I'm hoping folks can see me. I hope my camera's on. But yes, so this is the storefront. BMK, or Brooklyn Men Connect, Bridging Access to Care, was set up as 2 storefronts in a building in Crown Heights on Utica Avenue. And so here you see one of my staff sitting outside tabling, which is something that we did very, very frequently to raise awareness, primarily that Brooklyn Men Connect, as a program that provided services to LGBTQ youth, actually existed in Central Brooklyn. It turns out that we were really, really well situated. GMAD, Downtown Brooklyn, and another organization that we work very closely with, Housing Works' program, was out in East New York. And sometimes the commute was just kind of difficult for both the locations. But I mean, here we are, central in a very high residential neighborhood, being out and proud and providing services to LGBTQ youth. Now, on the left-hand side of the photo, you'll see a big Pyrex box filled to the brim with shoes. And so those shoes were acquired by a lot of the community members who were dropping off their shoes, and they would receive a $10 coupon to pay less in order to buy new shoes. Again, what was this done for? To help folks. I mean, it was kind of like we were given funds to do outreach and connect with the community. And so this is our way of giving back. to an area where there are some significant poverty rates, et cetera, and there's nothing like having good new shoes, particularly for their children. But this helped kind of even the plane as well. We provided a lot of services at BMK, one of them being HIV testing. And we recognize that in our community, there's a lot of hidden gay Black men or men of color. And so we were trying to make it so that individuals in the community could access our services without necessarily having to out themselves, by kind of making it so that we even planed, everybody could come and get access to our HIV testing services. They could get access to our referral services and our referral resources. And when folks would show up, we would provide services accordingly. And if someone identified as being a member of the LGBTQ community, then we could provide further services. And then again, one of the easiest ways is to set up a table, provide materials, educational materials, health literacy resources that folks can get access to without a problem. So I just want to say again, we had 2 storefronts in these 2 buildings. And the one that the gentleman is sitting in front of, that was in our drop-in space. Such a critical resource necessary for young gay kids in a community like that. It was indeed a safe space that young people could access and not worry about being harmed or hurt. It was actually a space that they could escape to in the case that they were feeling harmed or hurt outside of the space. So this is one of the things that made BMK such a viable resource in the community. So besides the fact that we had the drop-in center, we had case management services, we had counseling services, we had outreach and community engagement. As it said here, we provided, we had a food pantry, we had a clothing pantry, and then we also delivered interventions to the youth to kind of help them with some appropriate behavior change. So that was the BMK space. I was fortunate enough to be the director of that program for over about 3.5 years. And then there were some significant changes in the organization that made it so that that space had to get lost. The rendition of the program that exists now, I'm sure they're doing really, really great work, but unfortunately, it's not to the same capacity that we had when we had the opportunity to be in this space.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about some of our pop-up events?
Exactly. Let's go back to, can we go back to the screen with the shoes?
Yeah.
Please, I think that's important. Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Paige, and I'm just glad to be here. And I hope everyone is safe. I'd just like to point you to the shoes there in the products box there. And David mentioned it, but I just want to add to it that those shoes are very significant because those shoes were, the whole idea was that you will walk in someone else's shoes. And the goal was to help the community understand how we all are affected by HIV and AIDS. And the goal was to get people to bring in shoes. And as David said, they would receive a card, a discount card for $10 to go to Payless and buy shoes. And maybe Victoria, we put Payless out of business because now they're gone. But anyway, it was really a really great event, and there were a lot of people out for that. Our other pop-up events took place as well, and if we go back to the next screen there, this was Valentine's Day, and we made these huge, excuse me, cards, Valentine cards with hearts, and wore them, and we were on what street was that again?
Eastern Parkway.
Eastern Parkway.
In the middle of Eastern Parkway, right at the end
of Utica.
Utica, exactly, right? So there were a lot of people there, and we were giving out flowers, we were giving out small little cards, we were giving out candy, as well as condoms, and speaking to people about HIV and as well as safe sex practices. And it was really good because we had a lot of people come up to us and receive not only the condoms and the candy, but they also received good advice, I think, as well, which is really good.
And here you see in this image, right, there are 3 participants of the program who were connected to our peer health education program. And so they were very, very excited to be able to make those hearts and participate in this. They were so excited to be a part of this. It was so impressive. And some of them were struggling with where they were in how they represented as members of the gay community. One of them in particular, dealing with mental health issues. So they were one of them transitioning to transgender. So it's so wonderful to see these images and see these young people fully engaged in the aspects of this project.
What's also really good is that we had approximately 20 to 30 people who were basically young people, youth, excuse me, who went out with us, excuse me, as like an army. And that's when we did all our research when we were in Flatbush, measuring the communities to find out how much HIV was there, excuse me, not sure, how much knowledge of stigma was there, as well as homophobia. And with that research, we were able to decide how to use our program. I think that what is really significant to show, do we have any other slides regarding the other pop-up events, Victoria?
No, but sorry. Yeah, we have some pictures of the bus shelter at camping.
Yeah, can we go back to the bus shelter? I think that's very important, because with that bus shelter event, there were a lot of people that we reached, because it was right there on.
That was Utica and Troy Avenue.
Exactly, and we had a lot of people who came out for the event. I remember us giving out flowers. We gave out carnations. We spoke to a lot of people. We had the news was there. They interviewed us. It was News 1, is it?
Yes.
Bronx 12. I mean, Brooklyn 12, sorry.
Brooklyn 12, exactly. I forgot. And it was a really great event. We also had a congressperson came out? We had one of the politicians who came out.
Assembly member.
Exactly, assembly member. She came out and she was there. She spoke. She was also interviewed. And she thought it was really a great event that we had. It was so important because so many people saw this bus ad. The whole idea of how our community care and it's really important, I think. It's a lot of work. At the same time, I think that we touched a lot of people's lives and really tried to help people understand how HIV stigma and homophobia really makes this major impact on our communities. What's also very important, I think, to talk about how we went into the barbershops, into the beauty salons, and to any place that will receive us and allow us to go in. And it was quite interesting to go into a barbershop packed with people. Some of these barbershops it's within the Black community. You might have 40 to 50 people, if not more, sitting inside of a barbershop. Literally that many people, especially if it was a barbershop and a beauty salon at the same time. So you had a combination of women as well as men in this one vineyard. And we would go in there, and it would normally be myself and two other people, David or Stephen. And when we would go in, one of us would give out information as well as some kind of handout about HIV as well as about HIV stigma and homophobia. And then I would normally give a presentation or someone else would chime in as well as talk. And it normally would take approximately 10 to 15 minutes, if that long. We try to get them to be under 10 minutes in order not to impede other people's business as well, but as well in order to get as much information out to them as possible. And personally, I found to be a rather interesting event for me because it caused me to look at my own internalized homophobia and to deal with that as I was delivering this message and delivering the tool. And as I was changing, I was hoping that other people were changing as well. And you would see it. Sometimes we would have people asking certain questions, especially when we gave them the proper language. Because what became very important to us is that often in society, people will use certain slang in order to identify people who are gay or bisexual or LGBT. And they use the slang because they don't have the proper language in order how to address the systems that we have created. So therefore, what ends up happening, we would give them the proper language, like, I am a gay man, I am not a faggot. And to give them that language, and not to be so belligerent in it, but the idea was to try to help them to understand how words themselves can be offensive, and to give them the right tools to help them to understand how to combat HIV stigma as well as homophobia. It was quite effective, I find. Even as I remember going to a beauty salon, and to just give them the ladies who were sitting there the right tools, and you could see them start smiling and say, "Oh, I didn't know that." Particularly, I remember one of the salons was predominantly catered towards people coming from the Caribbean. And there was certain language that was used in order to identify a man who is gay or homosexual. And the language, I don't care to use it now, but was rather degrading. So therefore, I gave her the example of using that particular word, and then she did not really click, and then I decided to help her even more. So I said to her, imagine if a man used the B word to identify you. What would that feel like? And then she explained how she would feel. And then I gave her the proper language. And from that moment on in that beauty salon, I remember how their hospitality even grew even more so. They became kinder. They wanted to know more information. We gave them more information. They wanted us to come back and to talk to some more of their other clients, which we did. And it was just, I think that change was or is, shall I say, because I think it's still living, because I'm here talking about it now. It was truly a living document, and I think it is truly a way of standing for justice and fighting against and being a symbol of hope to the gay community as well as to the larger community itself, because it truly forces people to look at their internalized stigmas as well as their internalized homophobia in order to change that within, as well as to bring those gifts and skills out to the larger community.
That's great. So just to reiterate some of what Mark and Davis said, so there were many trainings that were done, and then large CBO trainings, and we believe we delivered to, well, we delivered to over 900 people. And the CBO trainings were actually multiple day trainings. We're not going to really have time to talk too much about those, but they did actually they worked with all members of the CBO who attended. And we talked about policies. We talked about practices. Bathrooms often get sort of focused on, but we did talk about, signage. We talked also, to go back to bathrooms in terms of like, well, there's a nice staff bathroom, but then there's like a not nice client bathroom. So there were lots of ways that we worked and did trainings with the CBOs to help them analyze their setting, their practices, their policies, and their paperwork to see what it was communicating to the community that they were serving. And, I'll never forget one time during one of the trainings, one of the workers saying, "Oh, I've never actually met a gay Black man." And, we all said, "No, you have. You just, they didn't tell you." So, and that was like, we had all of these moments of, oh, right, and that was where we used these sort of, levers to try to address people's prejudices and their assumptions and how they were stereotyping other people. Mark talked about the bus shelter ad campaign, so I'm not going to talk about that, but we did sort of have this call to action with the show of support and information about GMAT and BMK. And I do just want to very quickly touch on, and then I know we need to get to the science, so you can, the evaluation science of it, so you can sort of think about that with us. But all of this was happening in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement spilling out onto the streets of New York City. And it really, for obvious reasons, it affected all of us, but it also really helped us articulate just how racialized HIV stigma and homophobia is in the communities where we were working. but also the need for explicitly recognizing white supremacy as a driver of HIV in Black communities. And that really fed into the next project, which we'll talk about in a second. Before I go on with the actual how we evaluated it, well, actually, you know what? There's a slide where we talk about sort of some of our lessons learned. So maybe I'll just quickly move through this, and then we'll get back to what I think of as the fun part, where we get to talk more about the intervention. But so Mark had described this army of young people, and I want to also be clear, we paid everybody for their work. We paid research participants, reimbursements to do focus groups that informed this entire project. We gave peers an added stipend. Shh, don't tell anyone, probably wasn't, technically correct, but to do street intercept surveys, to do events with us. There was a lot of ways that we used the research funds to try to make sure that anybody who contributed to this project hopefully got reimbursed to a level that was respectful. I think that's really important. But how did we evaluate it? So our focal intervention community was Crown Heights, and our comparison community was Flatbush. So they're not adjacent, but they are similar in sociodemographic compositions. And you'll know when we get to threats to our conclusions, what some of the problems with that are. But we did a street intercept survey before the intervention and after the intervention. We enumerated every single block in both communities. We randomly selected blocks from subsections of each community. And then we sent teams of 4 to 6 people to intercept all passersby to do brief street intercept surveys with them before and after. We selected items from validated scales. We did not have time to use entire scales. And we did a pre-post evaluation model using GEE, and we used propensity score matching to control for time. And we used included select covariates to control for differences in community. And we also looked at the pre and post intervention administrative HIV testing data from BMK from their storefront. And so, this is the part of the story where we get a little bit sad, because when you look at this slide, if you look at the 4th row down, the neighborhood time interaction in model 3, we would hope that would be bolded. That would indicate that we saw a statistically significant decrease in HIV stigma over time between the two communities. We did not see that. We also did not see that with homophobia. So using our quasi-experimental approach with propensity score matching and GEE models, we were not able to demonstrate that what we did in the intervention community resulted in, or was, we can't say resulted in, because it's, there's all sorts of threats to causality in this kind of model, but was associated with decreases in our 2 primary outcomes, HIV stigma and homophobia. On the other hand, what we did see was this massive increase in the number of people who came into the BMK drop-in center for HIV testing. And this really, I think, reflects what Dave was talking about before in terms of how change helped create space at that. So, we knew about and know about the potential for space to become stigmatized. And so what we think change did, by focusing on the community, focusing on lots of aspects of what the community needs, safe space, but also material support, information, not just for LGBTQ plus individuals, but for the grandmas, for the daughters, for everybody. And so we saw a 350% increase in the amount of HIV testing going on at BMK pre and post. And we did begin to see it drop off after. And we were interested to see, there were lots of different HIV testing campaigns going on at the time. And so we looked at our community, Crown Heights, in terms of the New York City Health Department data on testing. And we did not necessarily see a big increase. So we didn't necessarily drive a big increase in Crown Heights, but we also didn't see a secular trend of increases in other similar communities that would be similar to what the sort of increase in testing that we saw at BMK.
Victoria,
Yes.
do you mind if I add a little context to
Yeah.
that, what it actually looked like? So for us and the services that we were providing there, initially the funding that allowed us to do the HIV testing at in the BMK space was actually only specifically for individuals who identified as members of the LGBTQ community, particularly the youth of color. But we were seeing so many people knocking on the door that we actually had to modify our grant so that we could provide HIV testing to the larger community, or else, in a sense, we would be doing a disservice to the community. So, and so this was exemplified where there were some female individuals who were coming into the space that were getting tested because depending on who they were choosing to have, sexual, have a sexual connection with, they wanted to make sure that they were clear, but also because there was an understanding that because a lot of the men in the community may be sexually active with both men and women, after she would get tested, she would bring in the guy that she was going to be involved with so that he could get tested just in case. So we saw a lot of that activity starting to grow. Something else, there was a mosque a few blocks away from our drop-in center, and we saw individuals of the Islamic community starting to come in, men, of course, in particular, starting to come in, and more increasing rates too, something that we had never seen before. And then we started seeing Muslim women coming in and getting tested because of what they may have presumed that their men were doing as they were allowed to do based on their religion and their faith. So it was really wonderful to see this growing awareness around HIV and the importance of HIV testing in that jurisdiction. And they were also incentivized to test as well.
So this is so interesting and important because one of the things that we're sort of also uncovering through our latest project is how, and this is familiar to many of us, how the siloing of both program funds and research funds actually is negatively affecting the epidemic. When you don't think about community as the center of activity and you think about populations. And I think that really just is a testament to how change worked to center community rather than a quote unquote population. But that's pushing against all the ways that we get incentivized to do this work or get supported to do this work, I should say.
And the last thing I'll add, sorry, Victoria, not to belabor this, is that even though individuals were coming in who were not identifying as members of the LGBTQ community, we have no idea actually what their activity was. So yeah, we would capture them as we captured them. We would find out sometimes later on, some of the males who came in once did come in later speaking to some same-sex activity, and then we were able to provide services for them. So kind of, again, regardless to what Victoria was saying, that regardless of how individuals are identifying, they're coming to get tested with the idea that maybe there has been, some activities that might put them at risk.
Yeah. So I know we want to leave time for questions. Just very quickly, there are all sorts of reasons why potentially our intervention on the attitudinal outcomes didn't quote unquote work. Maybe we didn't have enough penetrance or intensity. I definitely believe our spatial boundaries were way too large. If we had buffered around BMK and another, there is no other similar site, but another site that was similar in other respects in the control community, could we have found an effect? There maybe was a lagged effect, but that, also really, really hard to detect given all the secular changes, as Dave has already described in terms of changes in programming. Lessons learned, and then I think we should probably pause. And these were things that we sort of crowdsourced across everyone who worked on the project. And this is where I'm sure Mark and Dave want to jump in again. I mean, the local knowledge and expertise, I think if, we didn't have Dave as and Stephen as, our experts on the area in Brooklyn also, that would have, we would have been significantly less able to do what we did. And I guess from a science perspective, you might be saying, well, what did you do? We didn't, your intervention didn't quote unquote work, but, we think it did, but we just couldn't detect it. The peer-based program was really critical. Mark often noted that the street intercept surveys, we should have done those as interventions, because at the end of them, people would say, so how did I do? And he would have to sometimes inform them that unfortunately they were quite homophobic or something like that. And they were sometimes shocked. And he would then be able to talk to them about why that was. And so considering self-assessment as an intervention, which of course we know it is in many behavioral interventions, but we hadn't thought it would work for this.
Quite shocking, to be honest with you, Victoria.
Yeah. I remember. The CBO trainings needed significantly more time and resources. Many, many more supports to them were required than we actually were able to provide. Barbershop and beauty salon trainings were incredibly powerful, and we think we could have added trainings at at schools and churches. So with that, I think maybe we should open it up to questions. This is a picture of us at Mark, I'm sorry you're not in this picture, at the White House. It was really an incredible opportunity in the waning days of what feels like another lifetime after what we've all been going through politically and in terms of the pandemic. And then these are slides from our next project, which I don't think we're going to have time for. But this is just to end on, this is us at AIDS 2018 presenting both change and trust and some other projects. So I think that's it. Should we move into questions?
Hi, this is Bob. I'm going to let Stephen take over. I just wanted to say that was an amazingly wonderful presentation. I think this is really great body of work. And I can't help but comment how much we all long for the days when we had a White House that was receptive to the work that we do. And I think I need not say more. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for this work. Stephen, I'm going to let Stephen now facilitate the remainder of this time. Thank you.
Sure. And thank you again, Victoria, Mark, and David for this presentation on Project Change and its outcomes. I am not seeing any questions in the chat. So while we wait for people, oh, here we go. We have one from Giselle. Giselle, do you want to unmute yourself so you can ask the question? There you go. You're unmuted.
I think that question is to me. Is that correct, Victoria?
I can't see it.
I see a question that says, "Are you still doing workshops, Mark? And how many people did you use again for that?" We saw approximately 900 people, I think, in total. However, in the barbershops, we did a lot of barbershops throughout Crown Heights, as well as beauty salons. At this present time, no, we're not doing barbershops. I wish we were. However, in the barbershops, just to give you more feedback, what we did was we provided them with small flyers, that dealt with HIV, as well as I said before, HIV, stigma, and homophobia. And what we do is we do a short presentation inside the group, or should I say inside the barbershop, in beauty salons. And there we would take feedback and people ask us questions if they so choose to. Often people did not ask as many questions as I would have liked for them to have. However, you could tell by some of the questions, as well as I would say just the way they invited us in, as well as there was never an opportunity that someone would say anything derogatory or negative towards us about the work we were doing or about ourselves. It was apparent that we were gay men standing there talking to them, and never once did anything ever happen and all. So that was really good. And often in barbershops, I know from personal experience that those things could become kind of heated at times. However, never was there ever anything that happened. I think that barbershops and beauty salons inside the community, specifically inside the Black community, are definitely venues that needs to be used more often, because we're going to go and get our hair done, as you can see. And so, so I think it's really important. I think at least before the pandemic, but I think it's a place that I think that we can definitely use to help people understand stigma, as well as fighting against HIV or any forms of oppression, I think.
I'd like to add to that a little bit. Again, a little bit more context. You know, even though the study numbers may have shown challenges with the progress or the impact that the study was trying to make, I actually lived in Crown Heights for 11 years. I moved to Bed-Stuy, but continued to work in the neighborhood. And my barbershop is in the neighborhood. My barbershop was one of those places that was visited. Some folks were really very receptive, and some folks were not. But I tell you what, it's a barbershop that I continue to go to this day to get my shaves. You know, I don't get my hair done there, but I do get my shaves there. And I have seen over time changes in the language that is utilized in the barbershop to describe individuals of the LGBTQ community, and particularly gay men or gay men of color. And I see the barbers being more proactive about changing the language that's utilized in the space as well. So, you know, the numbers may not show anything particular because, you know, that was a snapshot in time, but ongoing, because interventions actually have a long-term impact or impact over long periods of time. I have seen the change. And it's been a wonderful thing because it's made the spaces where those of my community go a little safer.
And I will add, you know, Victor, I remember when we did all the numbers and we did the science, and I remember being very disappointed. I remember you, Victoria, saying, "Don't," you know, there was an element of disappointment that took place. But I truly believe that there were a lot of people that we touched, even when we were gathering all the information and doing all the research on the streets. I think that we definitely touched people and gave them the proper language and helped them to understand. And as Victoria explained, there were people who honestly asked, "How did I do?" as if they were being tested. And of course, I felt that was an opportunity, a perfect opportunity to help someone to get rid themselves of homophobia. And I would take it. I would definitely take that opportunity, and I gave them true feedback. And I think people really appreciate it, because I think that often people do not realize what they're doing. I think that we have been so socially taught that it's okay to use language that offends people. I think that we see it all the time, and I would love for us to go back on the streets, especially now, knowing the administration that we are under, and just to see what is happening. Do people feel more free to use derogatory language to talk about gay people or not? How do they think HIV exists in our community today? So I would love to go back and do this again if we could get funded. Yeah. Yeah. So.
Great. Thank you both. Next, we have Teo. Teo, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Congratulations. This is wonderful work, and really I'm very excited to hear what you have been doing. And of course, the changes that you all have observed are probably very hard to measure, but it doesn't mean that they're not there. So congratulations. I'm wondering though what your next steps are. How do you feel like because an R21 is to explore something and then you do the next steps. And I assume that you wanted to talk about that, but I really would like to hear about that.
Sure. So, and Nassim Sambuchi also asked a question that I can answer in answering your question as well. And so we're really excited. Actually, Mark and Dave and I are back together working on a funded R34 through NIMH. Yeah. Through the PRISM RFA that came out, where we are building on this work, we are funded to identify novel intervention components that focus on emerging stigmas related to HIV. So PrEP stigma, which, as we all know, emerged very strongly in the wake of PrEP rollout, and HIV testing stigma, which also is being detected, and as well as trying to understand how racialized, so building from this perspective that we saw, and that, no one wants to hear me talk about racism, but what was clear in our experience with change, that aspect of it needed to be addressed because it permeated everything and actually is the fundamental cause of so much of this. So we're struggling with it. We're wrestling with it. We have been on the phone. We've been drawing pictures because we're using this method called group model building, which Nasim is helping us with, Dr. Sambuchi, who I see has this question. And we are trying to use that to develop these new intervention components, but also then part of the R34 is to bring together people who have been using big data and other administrative or ongoing data collection resources to try to detect an impact of our area level or community level interventions. And of course, the COVID epidemic and pandemic, for all of the destruction it's wrought, impacting research is not at the top of the list, but it actually does sort of highlight the difficulty of doing this kind of work, which depends so much on face-to-face contact. As an effective component of it, how are we now going to both implement the intervention, but also to measure it? We had already thought that we would use these big data and other approaches to try to assess impact, because it's not feasible for us to send another army of people out onto the streets. Although I say that and I don't believe it. I think it is feasible. I think we just don't want to spend money on it. And I think that's a huge mistake. But that's also part of our society's approach to this. Like, there has to be a cheaper, high-techer way of doing this rather than paying actual human beings to make contact with other human beings on the street. But, I may believe that, but I also live in reality and I want to keep this work going. So that's what we proposed. I don't know if that answers the questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks for covering Nasim's question. We don't have any other questions in line. Perhaps you can go through the slides you have on charge in the meantime.
Oh, good.
Mike?
It's nice to see. Thank you for your words of encouragement. Yeah, I think I need to share my screen again. So let me do that. So charge is what we were just talking about. And charge, hopefully, it's a multi-phase R34. And we are using this approach, which Nasim is expert in. And she and David Lounsbury and Terry Huang of the CUNY School of Public Health, and David Lounsbury is actually at Albert Einstein, they are supporting us. And we've been doing their trainings to try to implement this approach, which is designed, the group model building, which is designed to really get a clear sense of how different factors, I'll use that word rather than their technical language, relate to each other and feedback or don't feedback to each other in order to identify places where we can, I'm doing all these hand gestures actually in front of the camera. I realize maybe you can't see me, but to places where we can intervene. And then we're going to prototype and test those. And then we are going to implement them. And again, hopefully another matched community control trial, but using these more efficient evaluation methods, either based on big data or ongoing research that's taking place in the communities, all of which, by the way, have been disrupted. So this is all sort of up in the air. But so that would be what we would do. And again, we're identifying places where we think we can intervene, and specifically with these new emerging or emergent stigmas, but also identifying how racism influences every aspect of it and addressing it from that perspective. So the goal is to do this group model building with different community residents. And we've already done 3 groups with a sort of a step preliminary to the group model building. And now we're actually beginning to do the group model building, hopefully virtually, with pieces of paper and drawings, possibly with participants online. And those are the next steps. Are you there?
We're all still here.
Okay, sorry.
If anyone else has a question, please indicate so in the chat.
And maybe somebody on the phone who cannot use the chat, Stephen.
Correct. Thanks, Theo. If you called in, please unmute yourself to ask your question.
Stephen, if nobody has a question, then I go for a second question.
Go ahead.
I think one of the big challenges is, of course, that with your intervention, you're intervening on so many levels and so many different behaviors that it becomes hard to catch the impact in a way. And I was thinking, gee, if you would focus on the human interactions that you do on the street, because I believe what you said, Victoria and Mark, that in a way in the individual interactions, that's where it happens in real, when people meet people. I almost would say I think that's a condition for change. And I was thinking, gee, if you would try to get a design where you focus much more specifically on those human interactions and in a way cut away from all the other issues that are also important, but let's see what happens in these human interactions. Would that be an option to do that? Could you imagine evaluating that in a way that would potentially show impact?
So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about how are we going to evaluate these new components. We just were talking about that yesterday, I think, on the phone. Today's Thursday, so yesterday we had a call, and we were talking about the possibility of doing, pre-post at the individual level with individuals that we engage in intervention components. I think that that in a way, though, feels very sort of old-fashioned, right? I mean, because we've already done so much of that, maybe not focusing on stigmas and systems of oppression, though. So, but there are people who do that, right? There are interventionists and educators who properly focus on reducing those forms of prejudice and discrimination, independent of any effect on health. So, I mean, yes, I think we could do that using the methods that we're all familiar with. I think that my struggle would be that if we're trying to intervene at a community level, we really do want to also community level constructs, factors, however processes are not just higher aggregating up individual level processes. Whereas this notion that there is, right, this actual thing that goes on at the community level. It's not just composition, it's context. And so our goal is to identify that and try to change there. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. But at the same time, you want to demonstrate something, and probably it is a matter of building blocks and trying to build that house with all the different elements together.
Yeah, I also think that, and I don't want to speak for Mark and Dave, but I feel like this is also movement building, as science can contribute to movement building. And movements are only shown to be effective, through history and through change at a very high level. So that would be one answer, although we do want it to work at a community level. And as we've said, we think it did. We just weren't really able to
measure it.
Yeah. But that's not, you know, that doesn't work in science, so. But we did get funded to do the R34. And again, we are hoping that, you know, we're bringing together what we call our brain trust of people who do this like big data kind of stuff to try to see if we can pick up a signal using and less intrusive ways of measuring. On the other hand, I balance that against the whole surveillance thing, right? Like we don't want to use surveillance society tools to assess the impact of our intervention necessarily if they are also being used for really negative things. So everything's a balance, but hopefully we'll figure it out. And I see David is saying group model building is a way to understand the important elements of stigma reducing interventions and then simulate the implementation strategies, right? So the simulation modeling that's part of the design thinking and systems approach is we don't have it built in right now. But we're trying to figure out a way to actually be able to do that and that's really potentially important in this environment where we can't leave our houses, right? So that's something that we could do in the shorter term until we get outside again. And David, if you can unmute yourself, you can jump in. David Lounsbury. I'm like looking at your chat as if you can see me. But maybe you're on the phone.
Is he there?
I don't know.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes. But there's an echo. I think you just muted yourself again.
Echo.
How about now?
Perfect.
Much better. Go ahead.
There we go. Sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead and chime in.
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah, I had dialed in and then I was also online. Yeah, so I think with respect to the group model building and going virtual, it's very interesting. That is something that I think is absolutely doable. We like the idea of kind of like high touch as opposed to like high tech, but we really are in a different world right now. And you know, Nassim and I have been thinking about ways of moving this to something that's online. And we've already had some preliminary experience just kind of teaching to systems thinking skills in these group model building techniques with people who wanted to learn about them, a short series at CUNY, and it's working well. I think it's a matter of kind of familiarizing everyone with the online platform, and group model building often requires you know, both big group and smaller kind of like teamwork. But we're learning about features that are really allowing us to kind of manage those things online. And it's ultimately, it's about, you know, just coming up with, you know, well-defined scripts for the activities. You need to do that whether you're face-to-face or online, and just kind of like being mindful of some of the tools that are available on these platforms like GoToMeeting and Zoom. We've been using Zoom right now. But I think that as we move forward with the project, the modeling will play a big role in helping to kind of do some theory building, some further theory building about, you know, why we think certain things will work. And the work that Victoria and colleagues are doing now is kind of informing that piece of it. And we see great potential for the modeling to really evaluate the systems change. Getting to Teo's point, it's a way to kind of simulate what we believe the effects are, and then with a good evaluation design, we should have some empirical work to support key assumptions about the effects of reach and exposure and actual behavior change. And one thing that the modeling would also allow us to do is really think about issues of sustainability. The project is going to be able to deploy certain strategies, and then we can see what the proximal effects of those are. But then the modeling would allow us to really think about what would it take to kind of like keep kind of a certain productive outcome of those efforts going. What would it take maybe in terms of frequency of, carrying out pieces of the intervention time and again in particular groups or with particular communities, things like that, what we're going to be exploring.
Yeah, that's going to be really crucial for us. It's going to allow us to do things through modeling that we can't do in real life. So, I mean, then I guess as I said that, I was thinking, yeah, but if we can't do it in real life, like at some point we're going to have to be able to do it.
Well, I think, this is kind of like our new real life, with the advent of COVID.
I have to go now.
I don't think, seriously, I don't think things are going to be the same. I mean, there may be things that will go back to some kind of normal, but I think things have really changed. We have kind of, there's a paradigm shift going on with respect to like the way we're all living through it right now, how we live and work and interact with each other.
You're right.
Yeah. It's going to be quite interesting doing this whole project, Victoria. Doing it, I'm just sitting here looking at you right now and looking at other people and thinking, how am I going to do these groups on this system? And I'm looking forward to it because it's going to be quite challenging for us in order to capture all the information and data that we're going to need in order for you to do the science.
Yeah. Hopefully Nassim and David can help us, since they've been doing it. I mean, we've been participating in those trainings, so it's a perfect opportunity for, us to feed our needs into each other and support each other. So we can provide feedback on what's been working in the trainings. And then as you all help us figure out how to do the GMB ourselves virtually, everybody should learn.
It's quite exciting when you think about it.
Yeah. So those are our next steps.
Thank you. Thank you. This really sounds great. And it looks like a year from now, we have to get you back at the grand rounds and to hear what you have learned in the past year, in the coming year, basically.
Yeah, that would be great.
This is really incredibly exciting and incredibly important.
Thank you.
Bob, you want to close?
Sure, yes. Oh my God, this was such a rich discussion and so important, particularly. So thank you, our guests, for joining us. Thank you, everyone who attended today. And stay tuned for our future grand rounds. And please, everyone, be safe, be healthy, and let's keep supporting each other.
An applause for the speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take president.